Welcome to Microbytes. I'm Rich Bowers, and today I'm joined by Christina Torres, a data and Gen AI expert. Good morning, Christina. How are you?
Good morning, Rich. I'm doing pretty good this morning. Excited for our talk. How are you?
Yeah, I'm thrilled. And today we're going to be talking about Claude 2. So really interesting. It's certainly a unique model and one I'm looking forward to learning about from you. So, Christina, to start us off, Claude AI is Anthropic's language model. And overall, let's just kind of pause right there. What can you tell us about Claude to start? Even if you want to just talk about some differences that it has compared to some of the other popular models like ChatGPT or Bard.
So, Claude is a relatively new model. The beta just released back in March, I believe, and that was for the first version, Claude 1.3. That version, I worked with it a little bit. It was decent. In terms of large language models, it performed very well in the sense that it outputted text that was comprehensible, it made sense, it answered the prompt. But with my experiences, how it compared to ChatGPT and Bard, it does it is missing a bit of the creativity that's present in the other models. But Claude, from what I've seen, is more geared towards just producing information that is guaranteed or near guaranteed to be truthful or non-biased. And it does do a good job of doing that, and mostly through outputting concise, accurate text.
Interesting. And I definitely want to discuss about why you think maybe their responses aren't as creative or whatever it may be. But let's start with the big piece of Claude. And now it's Claude 2. And as you mentioned, it previously came out as Claude 1.3. And there were some feature enhancements, which we'll also discuss. But the elephant in the room is that Claude is considered constitutional AI. Right. That's the big thing with Claude and the draw for a lot of individuals and even corporations. What does constitutional AI mean?
So, constitutional AI refers to two things. It refers to how that model was trained and also the principles that were used within that training. So, Claude specifically, it goes through two rounds of training and it does that in order to remove biases from the data. So, it's a new research they're outputting with this model, and they're trying to get more models to kind of adopt this mindset of removing biases and using the model itself to create data that accurately reflects the type of information that you want to output.
Okay, there's a lot of information that you just shared right there, and so many areas that we could just dive right in. But sticking with the constitutional AI piece. So when you're talking about principles, when it's first designed or trained, is it only the human oversight of rules? Is that how it works? So it's they're saying is helpful, honest, and harmless. So when they're putting together these rules or these principles, how do they focus on those areas only?
So, first, the principles. The principles are actually predetermined by the human creators of Anthropic's large language model. They sourced it from a variety of sources. So one of the biggest ones they took it from was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's to make sure that, no one is harmed unintentionally by the data that's outputted by the system. But they also take information and ideas from the Apple's terms of services. And I find that super interesting because they did it since Apple is one of the well-known forerunners of like technology in the current world. So their terms of services are very comprehensive on how you should respect people's digital spaces. They do a couple of other things. They also try to take some considerations of like laws from other countries and like non-Western perspectives, because just us as Americans do have a habit of like thinking of everything from an American point of view. And this is a model that ideally will be used worldwide. So they have to take that into consideration when deciding what is ethically sound to output to the world.
Okay, I gotta ask, have you reviewed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Have you took a peek at it?
I took a peek at the first two or three rules in it. It's a mighty long list, but they actually post all, or I want to say most of the laws that they follow on their website. If you head over to, I believe it's their research tab.
Okay. All right. I'm intrigued. So let's talk about that training of the constitutional AI, and you hit on a bunch of it, right? Using the Universal Declaration and Apple's terms, which again, really interesting. Also, I guess when you're training constitutional AI, there has to be some type of contextual understanding, right? So train the AI to understand historic and cultural context. Now, this may be an unfair question to ask, but how do they go about that? I mean, I know they use, what we just shared, and I'm sure there's legal reasoning and some ethical considerations that are put into it. Is there anything more that you could share on how that happens?
Yeah, so that's something that definitely pops up in the training process. So it'll be helpful if we talk about what that training process looks like for constitutional AI as a whole.
Cool, let's
Um,
go for it. Yeah.
Awesome. So the first round that it goes through is supervised learning. And supervised learning is when you pair a AI model with a human, and then the human basically gives feedback to the model to tell it, hey, you're doing a great job, keep going in this way, or you're doing a terrible job, don't do that again. But we do that typically through labels in our data set where we send in like, this is the response, this is the prompt I'm giving you, and this is the type of response I'm expecting, and these are why it's good. It does that, and it follows the principles that we previously mentioned that was like gathered from the Declaration of Human Rights and all of those. And it does a first round to try to determine what is the baseline of the model. Once we've gotten that, that is a standard large language model. It does a second round where it takes that first model, it outputs new data that is going to be used for training. And that new data is created following the principles. So any data set in its original or any piece of data in its original data set that doesn't align with the principles are removed and replaced. And sometimes more is generated. So the second training round is with a partially new data set. It's a mix of its original data and the newly created data by the quote unquote ethical model. This is a form of reinforcement learning. This we don't give human feedback because we don't want to reintroduce our biases into the data. So we let the model instead decide with rewards and penalties what is a good output and what is a bad output based on its original training. This overall process where we have the model do some base training based on data that we curated and labeled, and then create new data that we'll put right back into the model to retrain and make sure that it does not contain biases is a process that's known as reinforcement learning with AI feedback.
Cool. You sum it up perfectly. A couple quick points to mention. Is that initial set of data smaller than that follow-up data, or is it reverse? Do you know?
They're not necessarily smaller or larger. It tends to be about the same size.
Okay. And then when you're talking about rewards or maybe the opposite, right? How do they reward a model, or how do they say, hey, this is wrong?
So there's a feature in machine learning training that's known as loss. And we calculate loss by just if the model does something we don't like, we add to the loss score. And if it does do something that we like, then nothing is added to the loss goal score. And the goal is to get that loss score down to as near to zero as possible. So we measure it. It will have a couple of rules in its programming for when it's going through the training to automatically add to the loss if necessary.
Okay. All right. Makes sense. And you get a little bit more into neural networks as well. I'm sure down that path. Correct. So, okay, cool. And then when you're talking about the AI coming on in to help continue with their reinforcement learning or training, Claude uses scaling supervision. Is that correct?
Yes, they do. They do use supervised scaling.
Okay, cool. Can you tell me a little bit about what that is and maybe the difference maker that could be?
Absolutely. So scaling supervision is the idea that we can scale our supervision with non-human means. So this is the idea of bringing in an AI in order to take over some of those tasks that we would usually use. We would usually use humans in order to rate and guide the model. So this is reinforcement learning with AI feedback is exactly a form of scaling supervision. ChatGPT actually also uses a version of scaling supervision called reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is almost a one-to-one correlation. The main difference is in Claude's version, we remove the human bias by removing the human feedback givers, and that somewhat limits it. There's some advantages and disadvantages there between the two.
Okay, makes sense. And so when I see that acronym, I guess it would be or letters there, RLHF, reinforcement learning through human feedback, right? That's a lot of how these models are started. But in Claude's case, obviously there's those principles that are being followed. Now, this part's kind of mind-boggling, I think, especially for maybe someone who's not as technical. But the model is being trained by other artificial intelligence, right? And so I know there was a quote by Anthropic that mentioned that over time, data and influences that determines Claude's in quotes here personality and capabilities have become quite complex. So when I hear that or read that in a situation, I wonder if the AI scaling reinforcement or supervision is playing a part in that, because as you scale up more and more and more, there are complexities that end up occurring that in some situations, maybe like algorithms that humans don't know really what's going on. That's when the machines kick in. Does that sound accurate to your thought process too, as someone who understands this better than I do?
I would say that's very close to what I would say. Less the algorithms, more of like what's happening in the data being stored beneath those algorithms and how those algorithms are handling the data. With the two AI models working together, or I guess it's one model working with itself, but for this explanation, we'll say two. These two models communicating with each other is kind of like a double black box experience where we can't see exactly what's going on underneath the hood for both of these models. So as these algorithms talk to each other and develop more complex understandings of the data set they're working with, you end up with a network of information that it's hard for us as humans to exactly pinpoint where it got that information, how it developed that line of judgment, and how it got to that stage.
Isn't that wild? It's just wild how that works, right?
It's honestly crazy. I love to see how these different models have like an effect on each other because I don't know, the chat GPT reinforcement learning with human feedback versus like AI feedback, it produced two completely different models. Like when I speak to Claude, I feel like I have to have like a different personality, tone of speaking, and way of like effectively communicating to like get my ideas across. While with ChatGPT, I feel like it's almost more casual. And I'm willing to bet that that is based on the mode of training that these two models did. But I don't have the information to say it concretely.
It's interesting because even when you first mentioned, I think when you first started here, you mentioned that you felt when you're interacting with Claude too, similar to what you just said right here, there's a little bit less creativity or really, I guess, contextual conversation as opposed to the others. Um, you think it's more so due to more of that AI reinforcement training versus human, or do you think it's more so because it's following a set of principles and maybe is more strict or structured in that area?
I definitely think there is more strength in structure. Thinking about it, hmm. Has to be the constitutional AI, because with the AI training each other and following this set of rules, they're really trying not to deviate from their principles that dictate what is a good response and what is a bad response. So I can see that having a big effect. And as we talk on this, I'm remembering a point I saw in one of the rules that they borrowed, and it was choose the response that a child would prefer over the other.
Hmm.
And I think that is a prime example of why I may prefer ChatGPT responses over uh, Anthropics, because just with that phrasing of that rule, it leads me to believe that the model will choose an easier to comprehend, less complex answer, or just overly simplified. And I like information.
Yeah, throw it at you. No, that's intriguing, and I'm curious to see where this will go. Now, before we get probably more so down that path, that might be a different conversation. But focusing, on Claude, obviously
Mhm.
Claude 2 is newer. It's an upgrade over a 1.3. Can you share a little bit about the new features or even just overall features of Claude?
Absolutely. So there were really four major updates that I saw with Claude 2. Overall, increased performance, because, if you're going to update a model, you of course have to increase its performance. And with more time, we can improve the data that it's trained on, and we can take a deeper look at any biases that may have floated up. So overall improved performance, longer responses. That is what I'm most excited about. They officially increased it from, I believe it was 9,000 tokens to 100,000 tokens, which is absolutely massive. To go on a little tangent to put that in perspective for you,
Yeah.
what was it? Okay, couple of books that kind of line up, because 100,000 tokens is about 75,000 words. So that's a lot, and it's the size of books. Of Mice and Men, for example, if you've read that,
Yeah.
30,000 words.
So we're talking
And
more than double.
more than double. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest has about 76,000 words. And To Kill a Mockingbird, that was the last one. And that one has about 100,000 words. So you can essentially throw To Kill a Mockingbird into Claude and have it summarize the entire text for you, give it a in-depth analysis, write a comprehensive sequel. You just do so much with that amount of tokens.
It's a new version of Cliff Notes, right?
Honestly.
Right. So, okay, English teachers, watch out. Um, cool. That's amazing. That's amazing. Okay, so you have the 100K tokens, roughly. Again, you said 75,000 words. So that's incredibly impressive. Throwing in research papers as well. I can imagine the impact that would have. What else do you have? Anything else for updates?
Yeah, so they recently added access to their API. That was something I was trying to test out this morning, but I was struggling to find their API since they only linked their Claude website that's used to talk with their model online. But I'm sure that that API is going to be released soon, since they have a couple of other things on the docket too, like paid access to the new Claude 2 release.
Okay.
That was another issue I ran into, is they have that limiter on it.
Okay, and we're going to see more and more of that with all these companies giving it to us for free to start. You saw ChatGPT had their enterprise edition just released as well, so I'm sure they're going to go down this path. Okay, so paid access, and then that API, where would you find that? Is that going to be something that would be stored on like Hugging Face?
No, their API should be something that is hosted on their website and accessed through their website, but I wouldn't be surprised if they deployed it on Hugging Faces. The only issues with deploying it on Hugging Faces would be controlling access and paid access, but I'm sure they have that figured out with their accounts and their billing getting set up.
Cool, excellent. We'll keep an eye out for that too. Especially, I think Llama 2 is on Hugging Face, so you can compare a little bit too. Okay, and then while we're getting towards the end here, I have two more questions for you. The coding ability, right? Since a lot of our listeners here are software developers are in that space. What is the coding ability of Claude 2? Where does it excel? Does it fall short in other areas? What are your thoughts on it?
So from what I was reading up on it, Claude doesn't do particularly well with logic coding challenges, but then again, none of the models particularly do well with any logical based questions. They are improving with new prompting techniques, but logic is an issue for even us people to understand. So of course the models also struggle with them. But in terms of overall abilities, Claude recently did do a Codex human eval test, and they did a pretty good improvement. It went up from Claude 1.3's test score, which was about 50%, 56%,
Mhm.
to Claude 2 score, which was 71%.
Nice
So
jump.
very nice jump. It's
Yeah.
went from mediocre to very much usable with a ton of debugging.
That's
Um,
fantastic. And I saw in, sorry to cut you off. Also, that seems like they also improved on the board, I believe, right? Taking the board test for legal pieces as well. I don't know if you saw that, but a couple of the other tests that they're comparing against performance of humans and other models. Looks like Claude also improved in that area.
I actually missed that piece of news. Do you know if they were able to pass the bar exam yet?
I have to double check, but I know it was quite impressive. They would have beat me on it, I'll tell you that. And then from the tech side, I also saw that they actually excelled in Python. I think ChatGPT 4 is still the king or tops there, but Claude 2 is right behind ChatGPT 4 in Python. I'm not sure if you had a chance to review that.
Yeah, actually, the Codex Human Eval test was a test that was given in Python. And I have the GPT score over here. They got about an 86 on that test as well. So Claude isn't too far behind them in terms of technical skills when it comes to coding.
Good. That's great to know. It's good to see all these different avenues for people to enhance their own abilities, double check or test against.
Mhm.
And then, so as we wrap up, our last question here. When you're using Claude 2, I'm sure, like you mentioned before, in terms of the creativity or the context or how they're explaining things, do you find yourself using Claude 2 at all, or do you see yourself still going towards the Bards and the Chat GPTs?
So for me personally, I do still prefer ChatGPT, but I think that's just a personal preference because that was the first model I got my hands on and I got to work with very well. So it's a historical preference like Apple versus Android. But with working with it more and more lately and with the increase of tokens, and the ability to send files. That is my biggest thing. I can just upload a PDF or a CSV right into the Claude chat and have it analyze the data for me right there. I could definitely see myself using Claude for any large scale work. So if I need to like read peer reviewed articles, if I need to analyze large data sets, or honestly, even for data cleaning, because that is a pain to do with ChatGPT at the moment, since you have to break down the text into multiple different messages. And I haven't been able to concretely get the model to retain all of the information every time I use it. So having a model that is able to do that with the first message is going to make working with it immensely easier.
Awesome. And I think that's a fair response, right? We don't have to be dedicated to just one model for every single thing that we need to do, every task. We kind of have these basically subject matter expert models for different tasks. And nothing wrong with that. If you don't mind jumping around, keep a couple tabs open and go from there. So, Christina, any last words on Claude 2, or do you think we kind of wrapped up nicely on it?
I think we wrapped up pretty nicely on it. Only last words I would have is if you haven't gotten a chance to work with it, definitely experiment and have fun with it because it's pretty powerful and they're outputting changes and updates to the model very quickly. Claude 1.3 came out in March. Claude 2.0 dropped in June or July. So who knows? We might have Claude 3 or 2.5 in the next few months or even few weeks. So definitely work with it.
Amazing, the acceleration of these advancements. Christina, always, as always, super informative, a lot of details. I appreciate everything that you shared. And for Microbytes, I'm Rich Bowers. Take care, everybody.